recorded all of this and forgot to turn on my mic. Welcome everyone to hopefully my last active pickup swap for a while. Today we're going to be going over 3 pickups, 2 of which I've already done comparisons for before, and those are the EMG 85X, the Fishman Fluence Modern Alnico, and the new challenger, the Seymour Duncans Blackouts. All 3 of these pickups have claimed to be like a passive in some marketing of some sort, which honestly, it's kind of weird that we try to make actives sound like passives because I feel like they do their own thing, and I don't know, I guess that's a topic for another time. We're going to be comparing them, and I'm going to be giving my thoughts on how they sound compared to each other. For context, I use passive pickups primarily, so I've been looking for an active set for my FGN because it's currently wired for active and I don't want to rewire it. But I've been looking for an active set to at least sound close to my passive so that when I'm swapping guitars around, my signal chain doesn't have to change too much. Before we continue on though, if you like the content here, if you like comparing guitar gear or just gear reviews in general, please consider hitting the subscribe and like buttons. It greatly helps this channel, and I'm trying to grow this channel as much as I can. We're going to do the comparisons, but we're going to do something a little bit differently this time. I'm going to actually mention what to listen for before the comparison starts, and hopefully that will better help everyone understand my thoughts about each of the comparisons afterwards. We're going to go over a clean, a medium gain, and a high gain tone. My guitar is going through a Fractal FM9 with a Bogner Shiva clean and a Friedman BEOD for the mid gain and high gain. And so yeah, let's get started with the clean tone. The first thing I want everyone to listen for with the clean tone is the mid-range and where the mid-range sits with the clean tones. So my impression of the clean tones, let's start with the EMG. I feel like the peak frequency of the EMG's probably somewhere around 1K or 1.5K, and it's definitely a lot brighter. It doesn't quite have the mid-range, lower mid-range punch of the other two. But also, actually, interestingly enough, I think it has the most bass extension. Like, it just feels bigger, very low, but it doesn't have the lower mid-range that the other two have. The Fishman sound like the mid-range is pushed a little lower, so I want to say like 700 hertz. But basically it sounds like the curve from that 700 hertz on either side is a lot steeper than the other two. So what that means is that you're actually getting a little bit more bass cutoff and a little bit more treble cutoff as well. And it's actually not as drastic as I remember on the ceramics, so good on Fishman. These are my favorites for a reason from their lineup. It's because it doesn't cut off as much bass or as much treble as the Fishman Modern Ceramics did. And then with the Seymour Duncan Blackouts, you have kind of the same 700 hertz-ish frequency. It feels actually like the peak doesn't have quite as drastic of a roll-off on either side of it, so you actually have a little bit more bass and a little bit more treble. And I actually think the treble extension's on par with the EMGs. It's just the EMGs will sound a little brighter because of where the peak of that pickup is. Let's move on to mid-gain tones. For mid-gain, I actually want y'all to listen to the high end. I feel like they all distort a little bit differently when you start pushing the gain, but not quite to like metal levels. I think that's really where you're going to start to see the differences with this comparison at this point. All right, so for the mid gain, I think the EMGs are probably the brightest feeling. So because of where the peak is in the upper mid range, it just appears to be the brighter pickup. It doesn't quite have the same amount of lower mid-range grunt as the other two, but surprisingly it's actually warmer than the other two because of just how deep the bass is on this pickup. And the Fishmans are probably the thinnest sounding, and I usually wouldn't like a thin sounding pickup for sort of a medium gain, but they're actually not that far apart. These pickups actually aren't that far apart from each other, and so I don't think that it's something that you can't compensate with the amp. I obviously kept the amp settings the same for all three of these, but definitely the Fishmans don't have that bass extension that the other two have, and it does have a bit of bite in the treble, just a tad bit, but it isn't unpleasant or anything in my opinion. And the Seymour Duncan Blackouts are actually kind of surprising because they feel kind of like the Fishmans, but just with slightly more bass extension and definitely more treble extension. And so moving on to high gain. For the high gain, I want y'all to listen to both the bass and the treble frequencies, and I mean like the really high treble frequencies. I feel like this is where the nature of how these pickups go into a distorted signal really bring out those frequencies. All right, so for the high gain tones, with the 85X, when it gets to this much gain, the low lows, actually because they aren't being cut off as much as the other two, actually feel higher in volume. So while there still is that upper mid-range peak, the low end actually starts to come out with more distortion. I think the EMGs actually would sound really good with like a sludgier thing, a sludgier tone. I think the Fishmans are more traditional. And what I mean by that is they sound more kind of like what I remember from the older EMGs, where it's just like a complete mid-range push. The high end isn't quite as high as the other two pickups, and the low end is tight and nice. I think for if you just wanted to plug straight into an amp, I think this is probably the pickup to go to. And I've always felt like the mid-range push of the ceramic Fishmans are a little bit plasticky sounding. So I actually think the Alnico Fishmans are like perfect in that regard. And the Blackouts. So the Blackouts are kind of interesting because with this much gain, actually, interestingly enough, the high end starts coming out a bit more. The Blackouts, once again, as I mentioned, feel like they have a wider sort of hump with where the peak frequency, the peak frequency is. And because the peak isn't quite as bumped as the other two, I feel like the treble gets to breathe and come out with more distortion. At least to me, it sounds that way. So while I think the Blackouts won't be as cutting as the EMG because it doesn't have that same higher mid-range peak, I feel that the Blackouts still will stand out in a mix well enough because it does definitely have that treble extension. In comparison to my passive pickups, I really have a few notes that I want to share. I feel like the EMGs get the bass right. I feel like the bass sounds the most organic of all of them, especially because it goes so deep. You really feel that when you're playing as well. Interestingly enough, I think the EMGs do benefit from having a boost in front of an amp. It just will help tighten up and yet still give you the impact from that really low bass. With the Blackouts, you can go either way, I think. You can boost it if you want to. You can run it straight in, but it really gets the treble right. Between my PRS, which has passive Alnico 2 pickups, and my Kiesel, which have DiMarzio Illuminator passive pickups in them, the Seymour Duncans Blackouts actually have, I feel like the high end feels the closest. So when I'm hitting notes like higher on the fretboard, it just feels like more like my passive pickups than the other two pickups do. And the Fishman Alnicos weren't meant to be like a passive in voice 1, but they actually are very close. And the reason why I don't go over voice 2, which is intended to be the passive setting, is because there's a 2 dB drop in the volume level when you do use that voice 2, and it just, for me, it just doesn't work with my setup. I don't want to have to boost my patches just because I'm changing guitar. But again, the Fishman Alnicos do provide that passive like sound better than the ceramics do, in my opinion, and I would definitely not hesitate to use these if I needed to. Of all the Fishmans, this one's probably my favorite. The benefit of it is I feel like you could boost it if you want to, but it definitely has already that tube screamer-ish kind of boost if you want to just go straight into an amp. And so which one's going in my guitar? Well, the answer actually isn't in the frequency response. I like how all three of these sound. I've used all three of this extensively at this point, and honestly, I couldn't pick one just based off of sound quality alone. So the Fishmans are rated at about 200-hour battery life, and the EMGs are about 3,000 hours of battery life, and the Seymour Duncans are actually at about 1,400 hours. So really, I'm just going to be using battery life to determine what goes into this guitar at this point, because all three of them sound really, really good. And yeah, it'll be basically the EMG 85 in my neck and the Seymour Duncans Blackouts in the bridge. Alright, and so hopefully that means I've completed my active pickup journey. But I really want to stress there is no right answer. It is all based on what you want, and what I prefer might necessarily not matter for you. And so you're absolutely valid in what you feel about these pickups as well. So let me know in the comments as to which one you liked and which one you preferred, and if it would be worth it to like sacrifice battery life, if you like the Fishmans more, etc, etc. And so that's going to do it for me. Hope you all enjoyed this video, and I will see y'all in the next one. Later.